All right. Once again, good morning from here and good afternoon there, colleagues. My name is, just like we said, is Ayobami Popoola, and I'm presenting the topic in the middle of the pandemic, experience for built environment education on behalf of my other colleagues. My presentation format will just be, I'll take us through a brief introduction and the methods and the materials that are used for this particular study, and I'll attempt to present to us in quick form the findings and have a discussion around it. All right. As we are all aware, the effect of the pandemic across the globe and across various sectors, it's obvious, whether in transport, whether in education, whether in access to food, supply, demand chain, disruption of healthcare system. The footprint and the effect of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic across the globe, is well known. Not as far as I'm concerned now, is as much as no country across the globe is left behind in the footprint of the pandemic, whether positively or negatively, or whether directly or indirectly. If a country does not have a COVID-19 case, it must have been affected by disruption to their supply chain, for the case of maybe some landlocked countries. So this effect is generally known across the globe. But the main focus of the presentation to this paper is focused on the effect of the pandemic on education, most especially built environment, as the case might be. And when we look at the effect of the pandemic on education, we would see situations where 1 to every 5 students has not be able to attend school, whether formal attendance or disruption in their existing attendance. For high school, it's 1 in every 4 students, and almost over 102 countries is affected from this case. And when you now look at it, it brings to the question the issues around the global susceptibility question of education. How much of the instructional tool is sustainable or receptive to the pandemic, which we are actually experiencing now? How much of educators and instructors and even students were able to adapt fully or easily, as the case might be, to the pandemic experience? And how much of social distancing could we actually manage in the face of our existing way of life or our existing way of teaching, as far as instructing and educating learners is concerned? So this brings to play the tendencies or the limitation with regards to teaching and learning preparedness, issues around adaptation, issues around how much of e-learning could be embraced despite the continued argument for pedagogical teaching thinking, or our need for innovativeness, how much of this innovativeness could be accommodated when we now bring it to context of built environment cluster of disciplines. And these are the main argument here is that, okay, if this is the case, is the sustainability of this educational system, is it realistic? Is it possible? Is it visible? The peculiarity of these shocks during the pandemic raises the question of, do we need to change our teaching approach? Do we need to revisit our procedure to how we bring about learning to our learners, as the case might be? And these are situated now brings into context the issues around, in trying to explain this, I tried to create a kind of balance between experience and practice of researchers and academics from various article point of view. But mainly the justification for these studies coming from the study by Schneider 2020, which is based on the reflective study of educational approach during the pandemic. How do we reflect on our teaching approach, how we tend to disseminate information to various students in this era of the pandemic? Therefore, this study incorporates a kind of thematic analysis, and that takes me to the methodology and the materials that are used in this study. As I hinted earlier, this study is a qualitative method-based kind of research in which a phrase and thematic predetermined search was done through Google. We engage in some element of data sorting so that materials that are used for the study are selected purposively and so that it speaks to either built environment or shocks in education or adaptation in education, as the case might be, and mainly focused on the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic. And in all, about 42 articles were used in the review and in the analysis and two thematic analysis using in vivo in this particular study. And this takes me to the findings. And one of the findings that came out when we talk about COVID-19 shocks with regards to education, this is just a scrape of the key pointers that came out in this discussion. One of it was the issues around shutdown and cancellation and delays, and which, as an academic or maybe anybody that's involved in lecturing, as case might be, must have a bite of these at one level or the other, whether total shutdown, whether cancellation, as the case might be. And this emerged from the fact that communication or questions were not being answered. And this speaks to even the distortion of communication and evaluation method. How do you communicate to students? Issues around distortion in communication. And once this was experienced, we found out that it led to the uncertainty of educational communities. When do we resume? When do we have lectures? Would we be able to have this course or this particular module this semester or this session? So, and these are another thing that came out was the sudden review of curriculum and teaching approaches or teaching ideology by lecturers, which led to the emergency remote teaching. And this emergency remote teaching was actually much more shocked by the fact that most universities or most researchers reported that the infrastructure was not existing in most of the universities, most really in African universities and less developing country universities, as the case might be. And this led to increasing workloads for the lecturers and translating to psychological effect both for the educators and also the learners, and such that a kind of inequality gap was now created, as the case might be. Now, we now try to raise again, okay, these are the shocks. What are the forms of ways that people try to adapt to some of these problems over the year? After all, for over 2 years, as the case might be, across the globe. And one of it was issues around remote supervision was explored. Online blended learning was introduced in some instances. There was an improvement across the globe with regards to clear and more improved way of transparent communication. Sudden infrastructures was now being introduced so that it accommodates for the needed technological infrastructure needed for the effective teaching of both the learners and also the students. Universities, learning institutions now try to introduce a more long-term education plan. Semesters, some of them introduce longer semesters, as the case might be. Some of them introduce support teaching, as the case might be, more tutor sections, as the case might be. Then school attendance was introduced by logging into school portal so that this will manage students not being interested in coming to class or managing the absence in class. So, and when you now look at it, we found out that from literature, some of the collective argument of those pointers around the pedagogy of the distortion of learning, the innovativeness, both from the lecturer side, on the technological aspect of it also. The major education adaptation was the place of online blended learning, which was also introduced, as the case might be, where online flipped classroom was introduced, and an active method used in face-to-face class was made to be more participatory, as the case might be. So lecturers and learners now trying to introduce a kind of a platform that embraces participatory learning, whether in groups of students or even in general class. So there's a place of the innovativeness, as the case might be. We now try in this particular paper to now see how does this actually translate these shocks, these adaptations, as the case might be. What does this narrative actually mean for the built environment, cluster of discipline, whether planning, architecture, construction in some universities, development studies in some universities, civil engineering, which depends on some universities, as the case might be. And further, that three main things was key in the COVID-19 pandemic footprint in the built environment. One of it was the post-education practice, how the teaching process, at the case might, most especially for final year student, the teaching process has been disrupted. How much of it does it translate to their impact, or how much of value they should have gotten from teaching within that particular year? The issues around education and training. How do you educate students properly such that you still give the necessary, you are still able to capture, as the case might be, the necessary topics or modules or the entire curriculum, as the case might be, for a particular course? Or issues around rethinking the practice ideologies as regards, take for instance, the continued emphasis on site visitation, with the need to rethink this argument. And these are some of the pointers that kept coming out: the built environment, education, robotics, and the dilemma of the need for school-based training. How do we how does built environment cluster, as the case might be, try to create a balance of the need for school-based training and the dilemma of the pandemic, as the case might be? The subjective of built environment ideology owing to the role of dynamic space in education and training calls for continued play school student-based responses. Plays because they have to visit their site, but at the same time school because, for instance, people in architecture, students in architecture, they might need to come to school to translate their ideas into studio activities, as the case might be. And the place of student-based responses, students much more being responsive to this particular teaching process. And this brings to the issues around the various dimensions of the effect of the pandemic on built environment education, on the, should I say, the problem of maintaining a balance between studio and the site work, as the case might be. That particular limitation was a major issue when it comes to built environment cluster. And this generally brings to, just like I mentioned, there's like the rethinking of the field site trip narrative. Managing built space feedback was some of the things that came very strong. And towards the conclusion, we found out that one of the things that could be, or that was considered relevant, which is based on existing research, which could actually be replicated, as the case might be, in other countries, where issues around modeling and integrating built environment symbols into technology. Not all symbols in built environment are still within the said online modern teaching curriculum. How do we situate our curriculum so that it speaks to the studio balance, the studio side of the training, and also the modern teaching dimension of the training? And the other thing has to do with the fact that how do create such that the built environment education and practice as regards the future of it is revisited, so that professionals, which, if I may say, their learning process has been disrupted, could create a balance. And at the same time, the need for space redesigning, even within our curriculum set, is very essential, as the case might be. Thank you, colleagues. I can take our questions now.